The security camera at the corner of 5th and Madison captured him at 11:47 p.m. on October 15, 2011. A thin figure in an oversized jacket, walking with the careful steps of someone who had learned to navigate the world quietly. Marcus Rivera was 17 years old, though the streets had aged him beyond his years. The footage shows him pausing under the streetlight, looking back once toward the downtown area, where the restaurants glowed warm against the Seattle night, before disappearing into the shadows between two buildings. That was the last anyone saw of him. Marcus had been living on the streets for 8 months by then, part of a growing population of homeless youth that the city seemed to notice only in statistics. He wasn't like the others who gathered in Pioneer Square or under the interstate overpasses. Marcus kept to himself, sleeping in doorways of closed businesses, washing his clothes in public restrooms, surviving on the kindness of strangers and the occasional meal from charity organizations. Those who remembered him described a polite boy who never asked for much. Sarah Chen, who worked the night shift at a 24-hour diner on Pine Street, recalled how he would sometimes sit at the counter nursing a cup of coffee for hours, always ordering the cheapest item on the menu. He had these eyes, she would later tell the police. Old eyes, like he'd seen too much for someone so young. But he was always respectful, always said please and thank you. The circumstances that led Marcus to the streets were as common as they were heartbreaking. Aged out of the foster care system at 18, though he'd been 17 when he first left, he had nowhere to go. His last foster family had been kind enough, but they were struggling with their own financial problems and couldn't afford to keep him past the state's requirements. Marcus understood. He'd learned early that understanding other people's limitations was easier than fighting them. For months, he'd maintained a routine that kept him invisible to most of the city's residents. He would wake before dawn, pack his few belongings into a worn backpack, and find a place to wash up before the morning rush began. During the day, he'd look for odd jobs, helping people carry groceries, cleaning windows for small businesses, anything that might earn him enough for a meal. By evening, he'd find a safe place to spend the night, always careful not to stay in the same location too many times. The downtown restaurant district became a familiar territory for Marcus, though he rarely ventured inside any of the establishments. He would walk past the windows of upscale eateries, watching the warm glow of dining rooms filled with people who seemed to exist in an entirely different world. Sometimes, if he was lucky, a restaurant would throw away food that was still perfectly good, and Marcus would wait respectfully until the staff had gone inside before checking the dumpsters. It was during one of these evening walks that Marcus first encountered Chef Daniel Morrison. Morrison was already making a name for himself in Seattle's culinary scene, known for his innovative approach to Pacific Northwest cuisine and his temperamental perfectionism in the kitchen. His restaurant, Copper and Sage, had just received its first James Beard nomination, and Morrison was riding high on success and ambition. The encounter lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Marcus had been standing across the street from Copper and Sage, watching the last customers of the evening finish their meals through the large windows. The restaurant's warm lighting cast golden rectangles onto the sidewalk, and the autumn air carried the faint aroma of roasted vegetables and fresh herbs. Morrison emerged from the front door, talking loudly on his phone about inventory and supplier issues, his voice carrying the edge of someone accustomed to having his problems solved immediately. Marcus had stepped forward, gathering courage to ask if there might be any work available, washing dishes, cleaning, anything. But Morrison had walked right past him without even breaking stride in his phone conversation. It wasn't malicious. It was the kind of unconscious dismissal that happens in cities every day. Morrison simply didn't see him. To a successful chef focused on his rising career, Marcus was invisible, just another shadow in the urban landscape. That was 3 weeks before Marcus disappeared. The missing person report was filed by Jennifer Walsh, a social worker who had been checking on Marcus periodically. She'd become concerned when he failed to appear at their scheduled weekly meeting at the downtown library. Jennifer had been working with homeless youth for over a decade, and she knew that when kids like Marcus disappeared, it was rarely because they'd found somewhere better to go. The Seattle Police Department's investigation was thorough, but ultimately fruitless. They interviewed the handful of people who remembered seeing Marcus regularly, checked hospital records, reached out to other cities where runaway teens sometimes ended up. Detective Maria Santos, who handled the case, walked the streets Marcus had frequented, showing his photograph to shop owners, security guards, and other homeless individuals. Everyone remembered him, the polite kid who never caused trouble, but no one had any idea where he might have gone. As weeks turned to months, Marcus's case file grew thinner. New missing persons reports came in, other investigations demanded attention, and gradually, Marcus Rivera became another name in a system overwhelmed by the number of vulnerable young people who simply vanished. His photograph remained pinned to a bulletin board in Jennifer Walsh's office, alongside dozens of others, a reminder of the teenagers who had slipped through society's cracks. The restaurant district continued its nightly rhythm. Copper and Sage thrived, earning Morrison the recognition he'd been chasing. The city's homeless population ebbed and flowed with the seasons. And somewhere in the vast network of urban anonymity, a 17-year-old boy had become a ghost, leaving behind only security camera footage and the memory of eyes that had seen too much. If this story moves you, you might want to subscribe. We tell stories like these to remember those who too often go unseen. The seasons changed, and the space where Marcus had once stood under streetlights was filled by other shadows, other lives hanging in the balance between survival and surrender. But in a city of millions, the absence of one person can echo longer than anyone expects, waiting for the moment when past and present collide in ways that no one could have predicted. 10 years have a way of changing everything and nothing at all. By 2021, Seattle's restaurant scene had evolved dramatically, shaped by economic upheavals, a global pandemic, and shifting cultural attitudes about food, community, and social responsibility. The streets where Marcus Rivera had once walked remained largely the same. Fifth and Madison still intersected under the same streetlight, though the businesses around them had changed hands multiple times. Chef Daniel Morrison had become exactly what he'd dreamed of in 2011, though the journey had been more complex than his younger self could have imagined. Copper and Sage had earned its James Beard Award, followed by a second restaurant, then a third. Morrison's name appeared regularly in Food and Wine magazine and on cooking shows. His cookbook, Pacific Roots, had spent 6 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. At 42, he was considered one of the most influential chefs on the West Coast. But success had come with its own weight. Morrison's marriage had ended 3 years earlier, a casualty of 18-hour workdays and the relentless pressure of maintaining culinary excellence across multiple establishments. His ex-wife, Lisa, had taken their daughter Emma to Portland, and their relationship had become a careful dance of scheduled phone calls and weekend visits. Morrison told himself it was temporary, that once he got the new restaurant fully operational, he'd have more time for family. He'd been telling himself this for years. The pandemic had tested Morrison's empire in ways he'd never anticipated. Copper and Sage had survived, but barely. The months of takeout-only service, reduced capacity, and staff shortages had forced Morrison to work more closely with his food than he had in years, often finding himself alone in the kitchen at midnight, preparing meals for the next day. It was during those quiet hours that he'd begun to question what he'd built and why he'd built it. Morrison's success had also brought unexpected responsibility. As his profile grew, so did the demands for him to take positions on social issues, to use his platform for causes beyond food. He'd initially resisted, preferring to focus on what he knew best, creating extraordinary dining experiences. But the events of 2020 had made neutrality feel like complicity, and Morrison had found himself reluctantly drawn into conversations about inequality, social justice, and the responsibility of businesses to their communities. It was this evolving consciousness that led Morrison to participate in a panel discussion at Seattle University in the fall of 2021, titled Food Justice and Community Responsibility. The event was moderated by Dr. Patricia Reeves, a sociology professor who specialized in urban poverty and food access. Also on the panel were representatives from several local nonprofits, including Jennifer Walsh, who had continued her work with homeless youth throughout the decade. Morrison had prepared remarks about sourcing from local farms and providing living wages to restaurant workers, safe topics that aligned with his business interests while demonstrating social awareness. But as the discussion progressed, he found himself increasingly uncomfortable with the gap between his polished talking points and the harsh realities described by the other panelists. Jennifer Walsh spoke about the growing crisis of youth homelessness in Seattle, how the pandemic had made an already difficult situation catastrophic. She cited statistics, over 4,000 homeless youth in King County, with numbers climbing every year, but she also told stories of teenagers aging out of foster care with nowhere to go, of young people fleeing abusive homes only to find that the streets offered their own dangers, of kids who had simply disappeared into the urban landscape. "We lose track of them," Walsh said, her voice carrying the weight of a decade's worth of cases. "They become invisible. Society stops seeing them as individuals and starts seeing them as statistics, if we see them at all." Morrison thought about his own daughter Emma, safe in Portland with her mother, attending a private school where the biggest worry was getting into the right college. He tried to imagine her at 17, alone on the streets, and found the thought unbearable. Yet other people's children faced this reality every day, often just blocks from his restaurants. After the panel, Morrison approached Walsh during the reception. She was a woman in her 50s with prematurely grey hair and the kind of steady presence that suggested she'd seen everything and still chose to care. They talked for nearly an hour, Morrison asking questions that revealed how little he'd actually known about the homeless population that existed in the shadows of his success. "The thing is," Walsh told him, "most people don't choose to ignore them. They just don't know how to see them. We're all so focused on our own lives, our own problems, that we develop a kind of social blindness. It's not malicious, it's human, but it's still a choice." Morrison left the university that night with Walsh's business card and a commitment to think about how his restaurants might contribute to addressing the crisis. It was a vague promise, the kind of good intention that often fades in the face of daily operational demands. But something about the conversation had unsettled him, had made him aware of a blindness he hadn't even known he possessed. Over the following weeks, Morrison found himself noticing things he'd previously overlooked. The homeless individuals who gathered near the bus stop 2 blocks from Copper and Sage. The young people with backpacks and worn clothes who sometimes appeared in the alley behind his restaurant. The way his staff would occasionally mention seeing someone sleeping in the doorway of the building next door. He began asking questions. How long had these people been there? Did anyone know their stories? What happened to the food that his restaurants threw away each night? The answers revealed a parallel world that existed just outside his awareness, a community of invisible people surviving in the margins of the city he'd helped define through his culinary success. Morrison's assistant, Rebecca, had worked with him for 5 years and had learned to recognize the signs when her boss was processing something significant. She noticed him staying later at the restaurant, walking the neighborhood after closing instead of heading straight home. She saw him reading articles about homelessness on his phone between meetings. When he asked her to research local organizations that worked with homeless youth, she knew something was shifting in his perspective. "What's this about?" Rebecca asked one evening as she prepared to leave the office above Copper and Sage. Morrison looked up from his laptop, where he'd been reading about innovative programs in other cities. Restaurants that hired formerly homeless individuals, kitchens that served as job training centers, chefs who had found ways to use their resources to address social problems. "I've been thinking about what we could do," he said. "What we should do. I mean, we throw away enough food each week to feed a dozen people. We've got connections with suppliers, influence in the community. Maybe there's more we could be doing than just serving expensive dinners to people who already have more than enough." Rebecca nodded slowly. She'd grown up in a working-class family and had sometimes struggled to reconcile her admiration for Morrison's culinary talent with the exclusivity of the world they operated in. "What did you have in mind?" "I don't know yet," Morrison admitted, "but I think it's time I figured it out." As winter approached, Morrison began developing concrete plans for how his restaurants could contribute to addressing youth homelessness. He researched job training programs, investigated partnerships with social service organizations, and started budgeting for initiatives that would extend far beyond his kitchens. He was beginning to understand that success meant more than awards and profit margins. It meant using his platform to see and serve the people his younger self had looked right through. But change, Morrison was about to learn, sometimes comes not through careful planning, but through unexpected encounters that force us to confront the consequences of our past blindness. And in the complexity of urban life, where thousands of stories intersect without their characters ever knowing it, the threads of one chef's growing awareness were about to intersect with the mystery of a boy who had vanished a decade earlier in ways that neither time nor distance had made predictable. While Daniel Morrison built his culinary empire, Marcus Rivera's story had taken a path that defied every assumption about what happens to homeless teenagers who disappear. The truth was both simpler and more extraordinary than anyone might have imagined. Marcus hadn't run away to another city or fallen victim to the dangers that claimed too many street kids. Instead, he had been found, or rather, he had allowed himself to be found, by Thomas Nakamura, an older man who ran a small auto repair shop in the industrial district south of downtown Seattle. The encounter had happened purely by chance, 3 days after Marcus's last appearance on the security camera. Thomas had been working late, trying to finish a transmission repair that had proved more complicated than expected, when he'd heard movement in the alley behind his shop. Thinking it might be someone trying to break into the adjacent storage facility, he'd gone to investigate and found Marcus huddled in a makeshift shelter constructed from cardboard and a torn tarp. What followed was a conversation that neither man would ever forget. Thomas, a second-generation Japanese-American who had inherited the shop from his father, had recognized something in Marcus's eyes, a particular kind of exhaustion that came not from physical tiredness, but from the weight of having nowhere to belong. Thomas had experienced that feeling himself, decades earlier, when his own family had struggled after his father's death left them nearly destitute. "You can't stay here," Thomas had said, not unkindly, "but I've got a couch in the office. Just for tonight." One night had become a week, then a month. Thomas learned that Marcus had mechanical aptitude. He'd helped maintain vehicles at one of his foster homes and gradually began teaching him more advanced skills. Marcus proved to be a natural mechanic, possessing the kind of patience and attention to detail that the work required. More importantly, he had an intuitive understanding of how broken things could be fixed, a perspective born from a lifetime of adapting to circumstances beyond his control. The arrangement worked because both men understood unspoken boundaries. Thomas never pushed Marcus to share more about his past than he was ready to reveal. Marcus never took advantage of Thomas's generosity, working hard to earn his place and contributing more to the shop than Thomas had expected. They developed a relationship built on mutual respect and shared silence. Two people who had learned that sometimes the most meaningful connections didn't require constant conversation. Thomas helped Marcus obtain his GED and later supported him through community college automotive technology courses. But perhaps more importantly, he provided something Marcus had never truly experienced: stability without conditions. Thomas didn't see Marcus as a project to be fixed or a charity case to be managed. He saw him as a young man with potential who had been given a series of bad breaks and needed a chance to prove what he could do. Marcus chose not to reach out to the social services system that had been searching for him. This wasn't rebellion or ingratitude, it was self-preservation. He had learned through hard experience that official systems, however well-intentioned, could be unpredictable and ultimately damaging. With Thomas, he had found something rare: acceptance without judgment, support without strings attached. As the years passed, Marcus gradually built a life that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known him as a homeless teenager. He became Thomas's business partner, eventually taking over much of the day-to-day operations as Thomas moved toward retirement. He enrolled in night classes to study business management. He rented a small apartment above a bakery in the Beacon Hill neighborhood, decorating it carefully with second-hand furniture and plants that he tended with the same attention he gave to engine repairs. By 2021, M&T Automotive, the name a reflection of the partnership that had evolved between Marcus and Thomas, had established a reputation for honest work and reasonable prices. Their client base was largely working class, people who couldn't afford dealership prices but needed reliable transportation to maintain their jobs and families. Marcus understood these customers in ways that went beyond mechanical knowledge. He knew what it meant to have your entire life depend on whether a car would start in the morning. Marcus had also developed what Thomas called the gift of seeing. Whether it was diagnosing an engine problem or understanding what a customer really needed, Marcus had an ability to perceive things that others missed. He could tell when someone was stretching their budget to afford a repair, and he would often find ways to prioritize the most essential work while postponing less critical issues. He could sense when a customer was dealing with more than just car trouble, and he knew how to offer help without making people feel diminished. The shop became a kind of community center for people who felt overlooked by the rest of the city. Marcus hired 2 other mechanics, both young men who had faced their own challenges, and created an informal mentorship program that Thomas recognized as Marcus's way of paying forward what he had received. They worked on vehicles for several non-profit organizations at cost, and Marcus had quietly established a fund to help customers facing genuine financial emergencies. Despite his success, Marcus remained intensely private about his past. Thomas knew the basic outline: foster care, homelessness, the years before they'd met. But Marcus rarely discussed specific details. It wasn't shame that kept him quiet. It was a protective instinct developed over years of learning that his story could be used to define him in ways he didn't control. He preferred to be known for what he could do rather than what had been done to him. Marcus had also never entirely shaken the habits of street survival. He still noticed exit routes in every building he entered, still kept a small emergency fund hidden in his apartment, still felt most comfortable when he had multiple options available. These weren't signs of trauma that needed to be healed. They were adaptive skills that had served him well, and he saw no reason to abandon them simply because his circumstances had improved. The only person who knew Marcus's full story was Elena Rodriguez, a nurse practitioner he'd met at a community college business class. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on shared values and complementary personalities rather than dramatic romance. Elena appreciated Marcus's quiet strength and his ability to find solutions without creating drama. Marcus valued Elena's directness and her capacity for seeing people clearly without trying to fix them. Elena was the first person Marcus had ever told about the night he'd disappeared, about the decision to step away from a system that had never quite known what to do with him. She understood that his choice to remain missing wasn't about avoiding responsibility. It was about taking responsibility for his own life in the only way that had ever worked for him. "Do you ever think about reaching out?" Elena had asked one evening as they prepared dinner in Marcus's small kitchen. "Letting people know you're okay?" Marcus had considered this question many times over the years. He knew that Jennifer Walsh probably still wondered what had happened to him. He sometimes thought about the other homeless kids he'd known, wondering if any of them had found their own versions of Thomas and the auto shop. But he also knew that his disappearance had allowed him to become someone new, someone defined by his choices rather than his circumstances. "Maybe someday," he'd told Elena, "when I figure out how to do it without undoing everything I've built." It was a complex ethical question. Did he owe the world an explanation for his disappearance, or did he have the right to define the terms of his own existence? Marcus had chosen the latter, but he was beginning to understand that 10 years of separation had created its own kind of weight. He was no longer the frightened 17-year-old who had vanished into the night. He was a successful business owner, a partner, a mentor to other young men who needed examples of what was possible. As 2021 progressed, Marcus found himself thinking more often about the bridges he'd burned by choosing invisibility over transparency. The auto shop was thriving. His relationship with Elena was deepening, and Thomas was talking seriously about full retirement. Marcus was beginning to feel secure enough in his new life to consider whether it might be time to acknowledge his old one. But change, Marcus was about to discover, doesn't always wait for our readiness. Sometimes the past finds us before we find the courage to face it, arriving in forms we never expected and demanding responses we're not prepared to give. And in a city where millions of stories unfold simultaneously, the careful boundaries Marcus had built around his new life were about to be tested by an encounter that would force him to confront not just where he'd come from, but who he'd chosen to become. December in Seattle arrives with a particular quality of light, gray and silver, filtered through clouds that seem permanently settled over the city like a soft blanket. It was on such an evening, December 8, 2021, that the carefully separate worlds of Daniel Morrison and Marcus Rivera finally intersected again, though neither man initially understood what was happening. Morrison had been working later than usual at Copper and Sage, finalizing details for a new initiative he'd been planning since his conversation with Jennifer Walsh. He'd spent months developing a program that would provide job training and employment opportunities for homeless youth, partnering with local organizations to create a pipeline from street to stable employment. The program would launch in January, and Morrison felt the particular satisfaction that comes from turning good intentions into concrete action. The restaurant had closed for the evening, and Morrison was walking to his car when he noticed someone working under the hood of a vehicle in the parking lot across the street. The figure was partially illuminated by a streetlight and the small LED work light he'd positioned under the hood, creating a scene that struck Morrison as oddly peaceful in the urban landscape. Morrison's car wouldn't start, a problem with the battery that had been giving him intermittent trouble for weeks. He'd been meaning to have it serviced but had kept putting it off, the way busy people delay dealing with problems that seem manageable until they become emergencies. After several failed attempts to get the engine to turn over, Morrison looked across the street at the man still working on his own vehicle. The decision to ask for help wasn't entirely practical. Morrison could have called for roadside assistance or summoned a ride-share driver. But something about the figure under the streetlight appealed to him, perhaps the competent way the man moved around the engine, or simply the human impulse to seek help from someone who clearly knew what they were doing. "Excuse me," Morrison called as he crossed the street. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my car won't start. You wouldn't happen to have jumper cables, would you?" The man straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on a shop rag. In the mixed light of street lamp and LED work light, Morrison saw a face that was somehow familiar, though he couldn't immediately place where he might have seen it before. The man was perhaps 30, with the kind of lean build that suggested physical work, and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing little. "Yeah, I've got cables," the man said. His voice was quiet but clear, with the slight rasp that comes from years of breathing automotive fumes. "Let me just finish tightening this connection, and I'll help you out." There was something about the man's manner, professional but not obsequious, helpful without being eager to please, that struck Morrison as unusual. Most people, when approached by someone they didn't know, displayed either suspicion or an aggressive friendliness. This man simply acknowledged the request and offered assistance, as if helping strangers with car trouble was a normal part of his evening routine. "I'm Daniel," Morrison said as the man gathered his tools and closed the hood of his vehicle. "Marcus," came the reply. The name hit Morrison like a small electric shock, though he couldn't immediately understand why. It was a common enough name, and the feeling of recognition could have been coincidence. Perhaps he'd met another Marcus at some industry event, or maybe the name simply reminded him of someone else entirely. Marcus Rivera looked at Daniel Morrison and felt the peculiar sensation of time folding in on itself. He recognized the chef immediately, though Morrison had changed considerably over the decades since their brief non-encounter. The younger man's sharp edges had softened slightly, and success had given him a bearing that was more settled, less hungry. But it was definitely the same person who had walked past him 10 years earlier without seeing him, talking loudly on his phone about problems that had seemed infinitely important at the time. Marcus had followed Morrison's career peripherally over the years. It was hard to avoid in a city where food culture was so prominent, and Marcus read local business publications as part of staying informed about the community his shop served. He knew about Morrison's success, his restaurants, his reputation for perfectionism and innovation. He also knew from recent articles about Morrison's growing involvement in social causes related to food justice and community responsibility. The irony was not lost on Marcus that the man who had once looked right through him now needed his help to get his car started, but Marcus felt no satisfaction in the reversal, no desire to point out the symmetry of their situations. If anything, he felt a kind of curious empathy for Morrison, recognizing in him the same focused intensity that had made their first encounter possible, the way successful people could become so absorbed in their own concerns that they developed tunnel vision about everything else. "Let me pull my truck around," Marcus said, walking to a well-maintained pickup truck that bore the logo of M&T Automotive. Morrison followed, noting the professional appearance of the vehicle and the organized toolbox in the truck bed. As Marcus positioned his truck for the jump start, Morrison found himself studying the man more carefully. There was something about his movements, economical, precise, unhurried, that suggested deep competence. This wasn't someone doing a favor for a stranger. This was someone who understood exactly what needed to be done and possessed the skills to do it well. "You're a mechanic?" Morrison asked as Marcus connected the jumper cables with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this task hundreds of times. "Own a shop down in the industrial district," Marcus replied, not looking up from his work. "M&T Automotive. We do a lot of work for small businesses, people who need reliable transportation to keep their jobs." The way Marcus described his business struck Morrison as interesting. Most people, when describing their work to a stranger, would focus on their services or competitive advantages. Marcus had immediately contextualized his business in terms of its impact on customers' lives, revealing a perspective that went beyond simple profit motives. "I know some restaurant owners who might be interested in a reliable mechanic," Morrison said. "The delivery business is hard on vehicles." Marcus nodded as he finished connecting the cables. "Give it a try now." Morrison's car started immediately, the engine catching with the healthy sound of a battery that had been properly recharged. As Marcus disconnected the cables and coiled them neatly, Morrison felt the kind of gratitude that comes not just from practical help, but from competent assistance provided without drama or expectation of reward. "What do I owe you?" Morrison asked, reaching for his wallet. Marcus waved off the offer. "Just pay it forward. Help someone else when you get the chance." It was a response that caught Morrison off guard. In his world, favors usually came with implicit expectations, networking opportunities, future business relationships, social capital of one kind or another. Marcus's refusal to accept payment wasn't performative humility. It was genuine disinterest in creating any kind of obligation or ongoing connection. "At least let me give you my business card," Morrison said. "If you ever need restaurant services for an event or something." Marcus accepted the card politely, glancing at the Copper and Sage logo before slipping it into his shirt pocket. "Thanks. I appreciate the help." Morrison realized that Marcus was the one who had helped him, not the other way around, but something about the evening had left him feeling like he'd received more than automotive assistance. As he drove home, Morrison found himself thinking about the encounter. The quiet competence Marcus had displayed, the matter-of-fact generosity, the way he'd refused payment not out of false modesty, but from what seemed like genuine disinterest in transactional relationships. Marcus returned to his own work, finishing the minor repair he'd been making to his truck's electrical system. The encounter with Morrison had stirred memories he thought he'd successfully compartmentalized, but not in the painful way he might have expected. Instead, he felt a kind of curious satisfaction at seeing how the chef had evolved over the decade since their first meeting. Morrison had developed the kind of presence that suggested he'd learned to see beyond his immediate concerns, a quality that Marcus recognized as the difference between success that isolates and success that connects. As Marcus drove home to his apartment above the bakery, he found himself thinking about the business card in his pocket and the strange circularity of life in a city where millions of stories unfolded simultaneously. He thought about telling Eleanor about the encounter, about how the past sometimes surfaced in the most unexpected ways, demanding neither confrontation nor resolution, but simply acknowledgement. What neither man could have predicted was that their brief interaction had set in motion a series of connections that would soon make privacy impossible and force both of them to confront questions they'd been avoiding. In the complex ecosystem of urban life, where individual choices ripple outward in ways that no one can fully predict, a simple act of automotive assistance was about to become the first thread in unraveling 10 years of carefully maintained separation. But that understanding would come later. For now, both men drove home through the December night, each carrying a piece of the other's story, without yet understanding how deeply their lives had already become intertwined. The business card sat on Marcus's kitchen table for 3 days before Elena noticed it. She was preparing coffee on a Saturday morning when she picked up the elegant cardstock, studying the minimalist design that announced Daniel Morrison as executive chef and owner of Copper and Sage. "When did you eat at a fancy restaurant without me?" Elena asked, holding up the card with mock accusation. Marcus looked up from his laptop, where he'd been reviewing parts orders for the shop. "I didn't. That's from the guy whose car I jumped the other night, the chef." Eleanor's expression shifted as she processed this information. She knew Marcus well enough to recognize when something was troubling him, and she'd noticed a particular quality to his silence over the past few days. Not the comfortable quiet of someone at peace, but the focused silence of someone working through something complex. "The one from 10 years ago?" she asked quietly. Marcus nodded. Eleanor was the only person who knew the full story of Marcus's disappearance, including the detail about the chef who had walked past him without seeing him on the night before he'd vanished from his old life. She understood the symbolic weight that encounter had carried for Marcus, not because Morrison had been personally cruel, but because he'd represented the kind of obliviousness that made people like Marcus invisible. "What was it like?" Eleanor asked, settling into the chair across from him. "Seeing him again?" Marcus considered the question. "Different than I expected. I don't know, less sharp than he was back then, more aware of things outside his own world. He offered to pay me for the jump start, but when I said no, he didn't push it, just accepted it." Elena studied Marcus's face, reading the conflict there. But nothing really. It's just weird how life works sometimes. 10 years ago, this guy represents everything that made me feel invisible. Now he's standing in a parking lot needing help with his car, and I'm the one with the tools and knowledge to fix his problem. "Sounds like poetic justice to me," Elena said. "That's what I thought at first. But it didn't feel like justice. It just felt like two people helping each other, which is probably what it should feel like." Elena recognized the deeper issue Marcus was wrestling with. Over the years, she'd watched him build a successful life while maintaining careful boundaries around his past. The encounter with Morrison had complicated those boundaries in ways that Marcus was still processing. "Have you looked him up since then?" Elena asked. Marcus admitted that he had. Over the past few days, he'd found himself reading articles about Morrison's restaurants, his involvement in food justice initiatives, his plans to hire and train homeless youth. The man who had once represented willful blindness to Marcus's existence was now actively working to address the problems that had made Marcus invisible in the first place. "He's starting some kind of program," Marcus said, "job training for homeless kids, partnering with social service organizations to help them get stable employment." Elena raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a change from someone who used to walk past homeless teenagers without seeing them." "People change," Marcus said. "I changed." "Yes, but you changed by taking control of your own life. This sounds like he's trying to fix a problem he helped create." Marcus had been thinking about this distinction. Was Morrison's current activism genuine growth, or was it the kind of performative charity that successful people sometimes engaged in to feel better about their privilege? The question mattered to Marcus more than he'd expected it to. That weekend, Marcus found himself driving past Copper and Sage, not with any specific intention, but out of curiosity about the place that had represented such a different world 10 years earlier. The restaurant looked much the same from the outside, though there were small changes. Updated signage, a more diverse group of diners visible through the windows, a community bulletin board near the entrance that featured information about local non-profits and social services. Marcus was about to drive away when he saw Morrison emerge from the restaurant, engaged in conversation with a woman who looked familiar. It took Marcus a moment to place her, but he eventually recognized Jennifer Walsh, older, grayer, but unmistakably the social worker who had been searching for him a decade earlier. The sight of Walsh hit Marcus harder than seeing Morrison had. Walsh represented not just his past, but his choice to remain missing, his decision to prioritize his own recovery over other people's need for closure. Watching her walk with Morrison, clearly collaborating on something, Marcus felt the full weight of the ethical complexity he'd been avoiding for 10 years. Marcus drove home and called Thomas, something he did whenever he needed to process complicated emotions with someone who understood his history. Thomas listened as Marcus described the encounter with Morrison, and the realization that his former social worker was now working with the chef on programs designed to help people exactly like Marcus had been. "So what's the problem?" Thomas asked in his characteristically direct way. "Sounds like good work they're doing." The problem is that Jennifer Walsh probably still thinks I'm dead. Or worse. She spent months looking for me, and I just disappeared. Let her worry. Let her wonder if she'd failed somehow. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. You were 17 years old and scared. You made the best decision you could with the information you had. No one gets to judge that choice except you. But what about now? I'm not 17 anymore. I've got a business, a relationship, a stable life. Maybe I owe it to her, to all of them, to let them know I'm okay. And maybe you owe it to yourself to stop carrying guilt for surviving, Thomas replied. But that's a decision only you can make. Just remember that opening that door might change everything you've built. After hanging up, Marcus sat in his small apartment, looking out at the Seattle skyline and thinking about the different versions of himself that existed in other people's memories. To Jennifer Walsh, he was a missing teenager whose fate remained unknown. To the other homeless kids he'd known, he was someone who had simply vanished one night. To Elena and Thomas and his employees, he was a successful businessman who had overcome difficult circumstances. All of these versions were true, but they existed in separate worlds that Marcus had carefully kept from intersecting. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. Rebecca, Morrison's assistant, called M&T Automotive to schedule service for several restaurant vehicles. Morrison had apparently taken Marcus's advice about finding a reliable mechanic seriously and wanted to establish a business relationship with the shop. Marcus found himself in the awkward position of potentially becoming Morrison's regular mechanic while maintaining the secret that he was the missing teenager. Morrison was now trying to help through his youth employment program. The irony was almost too complex to navigate, but Marcus also recognized an opportunity to observe Morrison more closely, to understand whether his social activism was genuine or performative. Over the following weeks, Marcus serviced vehicles for all three of Morrison's restaurants. The work was routine: oil changes, brake repairs, the kinds of maintenance that kept delivery vehicles and catering trucks running smoothly. But it gave Marcus insight into how Morrison operated his businesses. The vehicles were well maintained, the drivers were treated respectfully, and Morrison had clearly instituted policies that prioritized employee welfare over profit margins. During one visit to pick up a repaired vehicle, Morrison mentioned the youth employment program to Marcus. "We're starting next month," he said, "partnering with local organizations to identify homeless kids who want to learn job skills. Starting them with basic food service work, but with a path toward advancement if they're interested." Marcus nodded politely. "Sounds like good work." "It is, but it's also complicated," Morrison continued. "A lot of these kids have trust issues for good reason. They've been let down by so many systems and people that they don't believe anyone really wants to help them succeed. We're having to learn how to approach them in ways that don't feel threatening or condescending." The conversation revealed something important to Marcus. Morrison wasn't treating his youth program as a simple charity project. He was grappling with the real challenges of reaching a population that had every reason to be suspicious of help from successful strangers. It was the kind of nuanced understanding that suggested genuine engagement rather than superficial activism. But Marcus also recognized the limitations of Morrison's approach. No matter how well-intentioned, the program was still based on the assumption that homeless youth needed to be rescued by successful adults rather than supported in finding their own paths. It was a subtle but important distinction, one that Marcus understood from having lived both sides of the equation. Marcus began considering whether he might have something valuable to contribute to Morrison's program, not as a former homeless youth seeking recognition, but as a successful business owner who understood both the challenges and the potential of young people in difficult circumstances. He could offer internships at M&T Automotive, provide mentorship based on his own experience, help bridge the gap between good intentions and effective action. The question was whether he could do this without revealing his own history, and whether maintaining that secret was still serving his best interests or had become a barrier to helping others. Elena noticed the change in Marcus's behavior, the way he'd grown thoughtful whenever Morrison's name came up, the increased attention he was paying to news about youth homelessness programs, the subtle signs that suggested he was wrestling with a significant decision. "You're thinking about telling him, aren't you?" she said one evening as they prepared dinner together. Marcus paused in his chopping of vegetables. Maybe. Not everything, necessarily. But something. I keep thinking about all these kids he's trying to help, and whether I might be able to offer something useful based on my own experience. And you can't do that without revealing who you are. I could try, but it would be dishonest. If I'm going to help with something like this, it needs to be based on honesty, not on maintaining a fiction about my past. Eleanor understood the weight of what Marcus was considering. For 10 years, his carefully constructed privacy had protected him, allowed him to build a new life without being defined by his difficult past. Revealing his identity to Morrison would inevitably lead to other revelations, other connections, other complications that might threaten the stability he'd worked so hard to achieve. But Elena also recognized that Marcus had reached a point in his life where the protective barriers he'd built might be limiting his ability to contribute to something larger than himself. His experience, both the trauma of homelessness and the success of recovery, gave him unique insights that could genuinely help other young people facing similar challenges. "Whatever you decide," Eleanor said, "I'll support you, but don't make this decision based on guilt about the past. Make it based on what you want to do with your future." As January approached and Morrison's youth employment program prepared to launch, Marcus found himself at a crossroads that he'd been avoiding for a decade. The boy who had disappeared into the Seattle night in 2011 had become a man with resources, knowledge, and the ability to make a difference in other people's lives. The question was whether he was ready to step out of the shadows he'd carefully maintained, and whether doing so would honor or betray the journey that had brought him to this moment of choice. The answer, Marcus was beginning to understand, would require him to decide not just who he had been, but who he wanted to become, and whether the man he'd built could coexist with the boy he'd once been. In a world where past and present were no longer separate stories, but interconnected parts of a larger narrative that was still being written. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late January, just as Marcus was reviewing the previous day's work orders in his small office above the shop floor. Elena's voice carried an urgency that immediately commanded his attention. "You need to see today's Seattle Times," she said without preamble. "Online. There's an article about Morrison's program and, Marcus, there's a photograph." Marcus pulled up the newspaper's website on his computer, scanning for the article Elena referenced. He found it under the local news section. "Renowned chef launches innovative program for homeless youth." The piece was accompanied by several photographs of Morrison working with young people in the Copper and Sage kitchen, teaching them basic food preparation skills as part of his new employment initiative. But it was the final photograph that stopped Marcus cold. It showed Morrison and Jennifer Walsh standing together outside the restaurant, holding a bulletin board covered with missing person flyers. The caption read, "Chef Morrison and social worker Jennifer Walsh display photos of missing homeless youth they hope to help through the new program." Marcus recognized several faces on the board, kids he'd known during his own time on the streets, faces that were now 10 years older in his memory, but frozen in time in these photographs. And there in the center of the board was his own face, Marcus Rivera, age 17, missing since October 2011. The sight of his own missing person flyer, still active after a decade, hit Marcus with unexpected force. He'd known intellectually that he remained officially missing, but seeing his teenage face displayed as part of Morrison's well-intentioned outreach felt like a violation of the carefully constructed boundaries he'd maintained around his past and present lives. Elena arrived at the shop 20 minutes later, having closed her clinic for lunch to drive over. She found Marcus sitting at his desk, staring at the computer screen with an expression she'd rarely seen. Not quite shock, but something closer to the realization that a decision he'd been avoiding had just been made for him. "This changes things," Marcus said quietly. Elena nodded. "Morrison is going to see that board every day. Eventually, someone is going to make the connection between the missing teenager in the photograph and the mechanic who's been servicing his vehicles." Marcus had already considered this possibility. Seattle's business community was smaller than people realized, and the automotive industry was particularly close-knit. It was only a matter of time before someone who knew Marcus's current identity encountered his missing person information and began asking questions. "What are you thinking?" Elena asked. Marcus was thinking about the profound irony of the situation. Morrison's program was designed to help homeless youth by providing them with job training and stable employment, exactly what Thomas had provided for Marcus 10 years earlier. The chef was now actively working to solve the problem that had made Marcus invisible to him in the first place, while simultaneously displaying Marcus's photograph as an example of the young people he was trying to find and help. "I'm thinking that hiding isn't serving anyone anymore," Marcus said. "Not me, not the kids Morrison is trying to help, not Jennifer Walsh, who's probably still wondering what happened to me." Eleanor recognized the shift in Marcus's tone. This wasn't the voice of someone wrestling with a difficult decision. This was the voice of someone who had already decided and was now planning how to act on that decision. "How do you want to handle it?" she asked. Marcus had been considering this question since Elena's call. The simplest approach would be to contact Jennifer Walsh directly, but that felt like it would create complications that might interfere with Morrison's program. A more strategic approach would be to reach out to Morrison himself, but that risked turning his revelation into a media story that would overshadow the important work the program was trying to accomplish. "I think I need to talk to Morrison first," Marcus said. "Not as a missing person, but as someone who might be able to help with his program. I can offer internships at the shop, maybe some mentorship based on my own experience. Then, if it feels right, I can tell him the rest." Elena understood the wisdom of this approach. It would allow Marcus to establish his current identity and capabilities before revealing his past, ensuring that any collaboration would be based on what he could contribute rather than what he had survived. That afternoon, Marcus called Copper and Sage and asked to speak with Morrison. Rebecca, who had coordinated the vehicle maintenance for Morrison's restaurants, recognized Marcus's voice and put him through immediately. "Marcus," Morrison said, sounding genuinely pleased to hear from him. "How are the trucks running?" "Great, everything's running smoothly. But I'm actually calling about something else. I saw the article in the Times about your youth employment program. I was wondering if you might be interested in expanding it beyond restaurant work." Morrison's interest was immediate. "What did you have in mind?" "I've been thinking about offering internships at my shop. Automotive repair is good work. Steady demand, decent pay, opportunity for advancement. And it might appeal to kids who aren't interested in food service but want to learn a trade." The offer clearly intrigued Morrison. "That's exactly the kind of partnership we're hoping to develop. Would you be willing to meet and discuss it in more detail?" They arranged to meet the following afternoon at M&T Automotive. Marcus wanted Morrison to see the shop, to understand the kind of operation he'd built, and the environment he could offer to young people who needed both skills and stability. That evening, Marcus called Thomas to inform him about the decision and ask for his thoughts on bringing teenage interns into the shop. Thomas characteristically was supportive, but practical. "You sure you're ready for this?" Thomas asked. "Once you start down this path, there's no going back to the quiet life you've built." "I don't think the quiet life is an option anymore," Marcus replied, "and maybe it shouldn't be. I've got something to offer these kids that Morrison can't, someone who actually lived what they're living and found a way through it." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have been proud of the man you've become," he said finally. It was the closest thing to emotional expression that Thomas ever allowed himself, and Marcus understood the depth of approval it represented. The next afternoon, Morrison arrived at M&T Automotive precisely on time, driving one of the vehicles Marcus had recently serviced. Marcus watched through the office window as Morrison surveyed the shop, noting the clean workspace, the organized tools, the professional appearance of the facility. It was clear that Morrison was evaluating not just the business, but the environment he might be asking vulnerable young people to enter. Marcus gave Morrison a complete tour of the shop, explaining the different types of work they performed and the skills required for each. He introduced Morrison to his two employees, both of whom had their own stories of overcoming difficult circumstances, though Marcus didn't share those details. What mattered was that Morrison could see how the shop operated, efficiently, professionally, with an atmosphere of mutual respect and shared purpose. "This is impressive," Morrison said as they concluded the tour. "You've built something really solid here." "It took time," Marcus replied, "and the right kind of help when I needed it most." Morrison caught the subtle reference but didn't push for details. What would an internship program look like? Marcus had thought through this carefully. Start with basic skills, tool identification, safety procedures, simple maintenance tasks. Build up to more complex work as they demonstrate competency and interest. Pay them from day one, even if it's just minimum wage. Give them a sense that this is real work, not charity. And if they're not ready for the structure, if they have trust issues or other challenges, then we work with them at their pace, Marcus said. Some of these kids have been let down by every authority figure they've ever known. You can't fix that with a job training program, but you can show them that not every adult is going to disappoint them. Morrison nodded slowly. You sound like you understand these kids pretty well. Marcus met Morrison's eyes directly. I understand them better than you might think. There was something in Marcus's tone that made Morrison look at him more carefully, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. But before Morrison could ask any follow-up questions, Marcus continued with practical details about scheduling, supervision, and coordination with Morrison's existing program. They spent another hour working out specifics, with Morrison growing increasingly enthusiastic about the partnership. As they prepared to conclude the meeting, Morrison mentioned the missing person bulletin board that had prompted Marcus's decision to reach out. We're hoping some of these kids will see the board and recognize someone they knew, maybe provide information about what happened to them, Morrison said. Jennifer Walsh, the social worker I'm partnering with, has been searching for some of these young people for years. Marcus felt the weight of the moment, the opportunity to reveal his identity in a way that felt natural rather than dramatic. But something held him back, not fear, but a recognition that this revelation would fundamentally change the dynamic between him and Morrison, and he wanted to be certain that their professional partnership was solid before introducing the personal complications of his past. That must be difficult, Marcus said, not knowing what happened to them. Walsh says the not knowing is the worst part. Whether they're safe, whether they found help, whether they're even still alive. She takes it personally when kids disappear without a trace. As Morrison left the shop, Marcus stood in the doorway watching him drive away, knowing that their next conversation would likely be very different. The partnership they'd just established would provide the foundation for a more complex relationship, one that would require both men to reconsider their assumptions about each other and about the ways that past and present could intersect. Marcus was no longer the invisible teenager who had walked past Copper and Sage 10 years earlier, and Morrison was no longer the self-absorbed chef who had looked right through him. But the question remained. When Marcus finally revealed the connection between who he had been and who he had become, would it strengthen their partnership or complicate it beyond repair? The answer would come soon enough. For now, Marcus was content to know that he'd taken the first step toward bridging the gap between his past and present, and that whatever came next would be based on honesty rather than the carefully maintained fiction that had protected him for so long. The moment of truth arrived exactly 1 week later, in a way that Marcus hadn't anticipated. He was in the shop's office reviewing applications Morrison had forwarded from potential interns when he heard familiar voices in the garage below. Through the window, he could see Morrison talking with Jennifer Walsh, both of them examining the undercarriage of one of the restaurant's delivery vehicles that had been making unusual noises. Marcus had known this moment would come, had even been planning to initiate it himself, but seeing Walsh in his shop less than 30 feet away brought a rush of emotions he hadn't fully prepared for. This was the woman who had spent months searching for him, who had filed the missing person report, who had probably wondered for years whether she'd failed him somehow. Marcus took a deep breath and walked downstairs, knowing that the conversation he was about to have would change everything. "Mr. Morrison," he said, approaching the pair, "is there a problem with the vehicle?" Morrison looked up from his examination of the exhaust system. "Just a rattling sound when we accelerate. Probably nothing serious, but I thought we should have you take a look." "Of course," Marcus said, then turned to Walsh. "I don't think we've been formally introduced. I'm Marcus Rivera." The effect of his name on Walsh was immediate and unmistakable. Her face went through a rapid succession of expressions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally something approaching shock. She stared at Marcus for a long moment, clearly trying to reconcile the successful businessman before her with the missing teenager whose case had haunted her for a decade. "Marcus Rivera," she repeated slowly. from the missing person case from 2011. Morrison looked between them, not yet understanding what was happening but recognizing that something significant was occurring. "Yes," Marcus said quietly, "though I prefer to think of myself as Marcus Rivera, owner of M&T Automotive. The missing part, well, that's complicated." Walsh sat down heavily on a nearby workbench as if her legs could no longer support her. "You've been here the whole time? In Seattle?" "Not exactly here," Marcus said. "But yes, in Seattle. I never left the city." Morrison was beginning to grasp the implications. "You're one of the kids on the bulletin board, one of the missing persons we're trying to help." "I am, or I was. It depends on how you look at it." The next hour was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in 10 years. Sitting in the shop's break room, he told his story. Not the abbreviated version he'd shared with Eleanor, but the complete narrative of his disappearance, his time with Thomas, the gradual construction of his new life, and the reasons he'd chosen to remain officially missing for so long. Walsh listened with the focused attention of someone processing information that challenged fundamental assumptions. Morrison asked practical questions about how Marcus had managed to build a business and establish credit without triggering any official searches. But underlying both their responses was a larger question: whether Marcus's choice to remain missing had been justified, and what obligations he might have to the people who had worried about him. "I need you to understand," Marcus said, "this wasn't about rejecting help or avoiding responsibility. It was about survival. The system that was looking for me was the same system that had never quite known what to do with me. Thomas offered me something different: acceptance without conditions, help without bureaucracy, a chance to prove what I could do rather than being defined by what had been done to me." Walsh nodded slowly. "I understand that. I've seen how the system can fail kids, even when everyone involved has good intentions. But Marcus, I've spent 10 years wondering what happened to you. Whether you were alive, whether you were safe, whether I'd somehow failed you." The pain in Walsh's voice was evident, and Marcus felt the full weight of the ethical complexity his choice had created. His survival and success had come at the cost of other people's peace of mind, including someone who had genuinely cared about his welfare. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "I know that's not enough, but I need you to know that I never intended to cause you pain. I was 17 and scared, and I made the best decision I could with the information I had." "And now?" Morrison asked. "What's changed?" Marcus looked at both of them, the social worker who had never stopped searching for him and the chef who was now trying to help kids in similar situations. "What's changed is that I'm not 17 anymore. I have resources now, knowledge, the ability to help other kids who are facing what I faced. Staying hidden isn't serving anyone, including me." Walsh leaned forward. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that maybe there's a way to use my story, not as a cautionary tale or a miraculous recovery narrative, but as an example of what's possible when young people get the right kind of support. I want to work with Morrison's program, offer internships here at the shop, provide mentorship based on actual experience rather than good intentions." Morrison had been quiet during most of this conversation, processing not just the revelation of Marcus's identity, but the implications for his youth employment program. "Would you be willing to share your story publicly? It could be incredibly powerful for the kids we're trying to reach." Marcus had anticipated this question. "Eventually, maybe, but not as the centerpiece of the program. I don't want this to become about me or my story. I want it to be about the kids you're trying to help now, and what we can do to actually serve them, rather than just feeling good about trying to help them." The distinction was important to Marcus. He'd seen too many well-intentioned programs that focused more on the inspiring narratives of people who had overcome difficult circumstances than on the practical needs of people still facing those circumstances. He wanted his involvement to be based on useful contributions rather than symbolic value. Over the following weeks, Marcus gradually integrated his story into Morrison's program while maintaining focus on practical outcomes. He didn't appear in media interviews or speak at fundraising events. Instead, he worked directly with the first group of interns, teaching them automotive skills while providing the kind of mentorship that came from genuine understanding of their experiences. The results were encouraging. Several young people who had been skeptical of Morrison's restaurant-based program responded well to the different environment of the auto shop. Marcus's ability to relate to their circumstances without patronizing them created a trust that had been missing from other interventions they'd experienced. Jennifer Walsh officially closed Marcus's missing person case, but she also began working with him to develop better approaches for youth who aged out of foster care. Marcus's insights about why young people sometimes chose invisibility over official help led to changes in how social services approached similar cases. Morrison found that having Marcus as a partner changed his own perspective on the youth employment program. Marcus's emphasis on respect rather than rescue, on building skills rather than providing charity, helped Morrison understand how to create opportunities that empowered rather than diminished the young people they were trying to serve. The partnership between the chef and the mechanic became a model for other businesses interested in addressing youth homelessness, not because of Marcus's personal story, but because of the practical results they were achieving together. Marcus's relationship with Elena deepened as the stress of maintaining secrets was replaced by the satisfaction of using his experience constructively. Thomas, now fully retired, took pride in seeing how the young man he'd helped had become someone capable of helping others. As winter turned to spring in Seattle, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from invisibility to visibility, from surviving to thriving to contributing. The scared teenager who had vanished into the night 10 years earlier had become a man capable of ensuring that other young people didn't have to choose between safety and dignity. The bulletin board at Copper and Sage still displayed missing person flyers, but Marcus's photograph was no longer among them. In its place was a small notice about internship opportunities at M&T Automotive, offering young people not just job training, but the chance to learn from someone who understood their struggles and believed in their potential. What had begun as a story of disappearance had become a story of connection, not just between Marcus and the community he'd rejoined, but between past and present, between survival and service, between the boy who had needed help and the man who was now able to provide it. By autumn of 2022, the partnership between Copper and Sage and M&T Automotive had evolved into something neither Marcus nor Morrison had originally envisioned. What had started as a simple internship program had grown into a comprehensive support network that addressed not just job training but housing, education, and the complex web of challenges that young people faced when transitioning from homelessness to stability. The success stories were real and measurable. David, a 19-year-old who had been living in his car when he first walked into the restaurant, was now a line cook at Morrison's newest establishment and enrolled part-time in culinary school. Sarah had completed her automotive training at M&T and been hired full-time by a nearby dealership, where her attention to detail and work ethic had quickly earned her promotion to lead technician. Carlos was splitting his time between both programs, learning restaurant management, while studying business administration with plans to open his own food truck. But Marcus had learned that success in this work was measured not just by the young people who thrived, but by those who simply survived, who found stable housing, who reconnected with family members, who discovered that they had value beyond their ability to overcome dramatic circumstances. The media attention had been inevitable, though Marcus had worked to keep his personal story from overshadowing the program's broader goals. When Seattle Magazine featured the partnership in a cover story titled Second Chances, Marcus had insisted that the focus remain on the current participants and the practical elements that made their program effective. Jennifer Walsh had become a close collaborator, helping to identify young people who might benefit from the program, while also working with Marcus to develop better approaches for kids aging out of foster care. Her initial shock at Marcus's reappearance had evolved into deep respect for the way he'd chosen to use his experience constructively. "You know," Walsh said one evening as she and Marcus reviewed applications for the next group of interns, "in all my years of social work, I've never seen anything quite like what you and Morrison have built here." They were sitting in the M&T Automotive office, reviewing files by the light of the desk lamp, while the shop floor below them stood empty and quiet. The late hour was necessary. Both Marcus and Walsh maintained demanding schedules that required them to meet after business hours. "What do you mean?" Marcus asked, looking up from a particularly compelling application from a young woman who had been living in transitional housing for 6 months. Most programs like this are designed by people who've never experienced homelessness themselves, Walsh explained. They're based on theories and best practices and good intentions, but they're missing something essential, the understanding that comes from having actually lived it. You bring that perspective, but you also bring the practical knowledge of someone who's built a successful business. It's a rare combination. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Morrison brings something important too, though. He understands how to create opportunities in ways that feel dignified rather than charitable. That matters more than people realize. The collaboration between Marcus and Morrison had deepened over the months, built on mutual respect for each other's strengths and perspectives. Morrison had learned to temper his natural intensity with the patience required for working with young people who had been disappointed by adults before. Marcus had discovered that his business skills translated well to program development, and that his experience with marginalized communities gave him insights that were valuable beyond the automotive industry. Their friendship had developed gradually, rooted in shared work rather than dramatic revelations about the past. They rarely discussed the night 10 years earlier, when Morrison had walked past Marcus without seeing him, but the memory informed their understanding of how easily people could become invisible to each other and how intentional effort was required to truly see and serve those who society overlooked. Elena had become involved in the program as well, providing basic healthcare services and health education to participants. Her medical background allowed her to address issues that other programs often missed, the ways that untreated health problems could undermine employment stability, the importance of mental health support, the practical challenges of maintaining medications, and managing chronic conditions while transitioning from homelessness. The thing that impresses me most, Eleanor told Marcus one evening as they prepared dinner in their apartment, is how you've managed to help these kids without trying to rescue them. You give them tools and opportunities, but you let them make their own choices about how to use them. Marcus had learned this approach through his own experience with Thomas, who had provided support without trying to control outcomes. The moment you start thinking you know what's best for someone else's life, you stop seeing them as a person and start seeing them as a project, Marcus replied. These kids have had enough people treat them like projects. The program's success had attracted attention from other cities, and Marcus and Morrison found themselves regularly consulting with organizations interested in replicating their approach. They'd developed a manual that outlined their methods, but they always emphasized that successful programs had to be adapted to local conditions and communities. During one such consultation, a social worker from Portland asked Marcus about the ethical implications of his decision to remain missing for 10 years. It was a question he'd wrestled with extensively, particularly as he'd gotten to know other young people who had disappeared and left loved ones wondering about their fate. "I can't say it was the right decision for everyone," Marcus replied honestly. "But it was the right decision for me at the time, with the resources and information I had available. The question isn't whether other kids should disappear like I did. It's how we can create systems that give them better options than disappearing." This perspective had influenced how the program approached young people who were suspicious of official help or reluctant to engage with traditional social services. Rather than trying to convince them that the system had changed, Marcus and Morrison focused on demonstrating that not all help came with strings attached and that young people could maintain agency over their own lives while still accepting support. Thomas, now 72 and enjoying retirement, remained a regular presence at M&T Automotive and had become an unofficial grandfather figure to many of the program participants. His quiet wisdom and practical approach to problem-solving provided a different kind of mentorship than what Marcus or Morrison could offer. "You know what I'm proudest of?" Thomas asked Marcus one afternoon as they watched David work on an engine with the focused concentration that had made him successful in both automotive and culinary training. "Not that you survived what you went through, but that you turned it into something that helps other people survive too." As 2022 drew to a close, Marcus reflected on the strange circularities of his life. The boy who had disappeared from outside a restaurant had become a man who helped other young people find their way inside, not just as customers or charity cases, but as valued employees and colleagues. The teenager who had felt invisible had learned to see others clearly, to recognize potential where others saw only problems. The city of Seattle had continued its relentless evolution, but the fundamental challenges that had made Marcus homeless at 17 persisted for new generations of young people. What had changed was the recognition that addressing these challenges required more than good intentions. It required the voices and perspectives of people who had actually lived through them. Marcus's story was no longer just about disappearance and recovery. It had become about connection and contribution, about the ways that individual healing could become collective action, about how the people society overlooked often possessed exactly the insights society needed to better serve those it continued to overlook. On a December evening, almost exactly 11 years after his disappearance, Marcus stood outside Copper and Sage, watching the warm light spill onto the sidewalk where he had once stood as an invisible teenager. The restaurant was hosting a celebration for the program's first graduating class, and through the windows, Marcus could see young people who had found not just jobs, but possibilities they hadn't known existed. Morrison emerged from the restaurant carrying a box of leftover food that would be distributed to current program participants who were still working toward stability. "Ready?" Morrison asked. Marcus nodded, and together they walked toward M&T Automotive, where they would spend the evening planning the next phase of their partnership. Behind them, the restaurant glowed against the Seattle night, a beacon for anyone who needed to believe that invisibility was not permanent, that past and present could be reconciled, and that sometimes the people who had been overlooked possessed exactly the vision needed to ensure that others would be seen. The story that had begun with disappearance had become a story of presence. Not just Marcus's presence in his own life, but the presence of all the young people who now had places where they belonged, skills that gave them confidence and evidence that someone believed in their potential. What had started as one teenager's survival had become a community's commitment to ensuring that survival was just the beginning, not the end, of what was possible. In the distance, the city lights stretched toward the horizon, illuminating countless other stories of struggle and hope, of people working to find their place in a world that too often looked right through them. But here, in this small corner of Seattle, those stories were being seen, heard, and honored by people who understood that the most powerful way to heal from being invisible was to help others become visible in turn.